Good morning. Are you awake? Okay. We had no air conditioner last night, so I'm operating on 2 hours of sleep and 10 espressos. But I will bring the energy if you do. Okay. So thank you to BSides for inviting me. I feel some kinship in that I Am the Cavalry did start 10 years ago. We're going to talk a little bit about why it started and what we did. 10 years is a long time, so think about where you were 10 years ago. So I'm deeply grateful to any volunteers that spend a decade trying to make the community or the world a little bit better. All right, here we go. So, depending on my pacing, we may or may not take questions, but I will be here all day so we can generate discussions in the hallways or during lunch and whatnot. In fact, we're staying until Tuesday. So, I'm Josh. I met some of you yesterday. I look forward to meeting more of you. A decade is a long time. We tend to think in quarters, or maybe in what happened this year, or what you're currently doing for your job. If you always do the easy things, if you always do the tactical things, if you always solve for the low-hanging fruit, you know what you're left with? The really hard problems that take years to solve. So about a decade ago, we're going to get a little bit into the backstory. I was growing increasingly concerned about the relationship between technology and the human condition. I'm not originally from the hacker community. I'm a philosopher by training who ended up accidentally in the hacker community, and then I became a systems thinker, and now I help write laws and get laws passed. So I'm trying to hack policy. That's not a really traditional combination, but it was deeply rooted in deep concerns I have that we adopt technologies for their immediate and obvious benefits, but we don't do a very good job at cost-benefit analysis until it's a little too late. And with each passing generation, we've been taking larger and larger technology risks. So time permitting, I may tease a framework I'm working on. But let's not only look in the rearview mirror, let's look forward. Where do you want to be in 10 years? Where does this community need to be in 10 years? Are we our best selves? Are we embraced by the businesses? Are we embraced by policymakers? Are we having the impact we want? Are we going to be doing the same thing 10 years from now at this conference that we are now? And to truly move the industry or change the world, you have to think long-term and then make near-term decisions to get there. So let me start with something I did 15 years ago. Please look at the ceiling in this beautiful building, steel and concrete. Most of you were here yesterday. Not one of you sat in perpetual fear that this building would collapse upon you and crush you. Why is that? It's because steel and concrete are dependable. They're reliable. We have professions, we have architects, we have engineers, we have site inspectors. People trust steel and concrete because society wouldn't function if we couldn't trust these buildings. Now imagine we made these buildings out of some weird new element that you could point a zero flipper at 10 years from now and cause the building to collapse on demand, at will. We're putting software, which is not nearly as reliable, into nearly every aspect of our lives. It's in our cars, it's in our medical devices, it's in our power, electricity, it's in our oil and gas. We are becoming as dependent on software as we are on steel and concrete. But this room knows full well that if it's got software, it's hackable. If it's got connection, it's exposed. So society overall has not heard us, has not learned that from us. And as such, we continue to take bigger and bigger risks through larger and larger dependency. So I wrote a response to the Agile Manifesto called the Rugged Software Manifesto, and just said that software developers are creating digital infrastructure. And unlike steel and concrete, it's not nearly as reliable. And it was an attempt to try to make them care about or be conscientious about the awesome responsibility that comes with writing digital infrastructure. But that was not really what they thought of when they woke up. In fact, if you look at the modern attitudes towards software, it's Mark Zuckerberg's move fast and break things. There's a guy named Reid Hoffman who said, if you're not embarrassed by your product the day that you shipped it, then you waited too long. Now, the people that built this building or built a bridge that you drive over or a tunnel that you drive through They don't say, if you're not embarrassed by the bridge that you drove over, then you waited too long. So we have not yet reconciled that software is not nearly as dependable or reliable, and yet we continue to depend more and more. So part of the origin story of this, you might recognize a few faces, maybe not all of them, is I was researching the rise of anonymous and hacktivism. It was a pretty risky proposition to do. This was, 13 years ago at this point. But I kept getting things right. I was not so much concerned about anonymous or script kiddies or denial of service attacks. I was concerned that this would inspire terrorists or non-state actors to adopt the blueprint and the techniques and do more harm to our way of life. And unfortunately, at some point, that's exactly what happened. An honor student from the UK in Birmingham was part of Team Poison, a hacking crew that attacked the Prime Minister's website, Tony Blair. A guy named Trick, Junaid Hussain, was arrested as part of Team Poison for his hacking escapades. While in jail, he radicalized and joined ISIS, and when he got out, he moved his wife and child to Raqqa, Syria, where he founded the Cyber Caliphate and was using social media and primitive hacking skills like Shodan and Metasploit to both recruit and train others to help attack the West, and also coordinated physical attacks. And it's pretty scary what one can do with Census.io or Shodan without much skill at all, especially when many of these critical infrastructure pieces have default hard-coded passwords naked on the internet. So it's not about can you disrupt basic human needs like water, food, shelter, safety. It's is anyone willing and able to do so? And because we were correctly predicting some of these developments, the intelligence community in the US and elsewhere invited us into Fort Meade, which is where the NSA is housed, for 2 days, and I got to pick 5 of the world's best hackers to come in with us. So H.D. Moore wanted his destructive skills. We had Dan Kaminsky, the late, great Dan Kaminsky, with his DNS experience, Gene Kim, and a couple others you may not know, but we tried to warn them that this was not merely about credit cards, this was not merely about privacy, this was not merely about intellectual property, this was about public safety, human life, and it was just a matter of time before we would see these attacks. And after several days of talking to General Alexander, this is before the Snowden examples that probably would have ruined this from ever happening, we tried to warn them and tried to help influence US law, but at the end of the 2 days, while they loved our answers to their questions, they couldn't act on a single one of them when we were demoralized and depressed. So we went to the airport that night, and I said there's about 10 minutes of silence where everyone was depressed, and I said, guys, the cavalry isn't coming. No one's going to save us. This isn't going to get fixed. We had naively believed if we just said the right things to the right people that they would go fix it, and they weren't able to. They said, until people die, we're not going to see political will to do things about this. They believed us that these were real concerns. They just didn't see enough will or public recognition to do anything about it. So I didn't know what to do about that, and I was demoralized. And without getting into the deeply personal story after 2 hours of sleep, I didn't have the second half of that equation. I knew the cavalry wasn't coming. What was going on in parallel was my mother had had a stroke and needed some hospitalization. We thought she would get better, but it turned out it was just the front wave of brain cancer. And over the next several months, we had to watch her slowly die and spent a lot of time in hospitals. And it was pretty demoralizing. She was quite young. And when you see that an average lifespan is not a guaranteed minimum lifespan, you start to question what's important to you, and you start to be very conscious of time and how little time there is, so you don't want to waste time. And ultimately, when I went to give her funeral and her eulogy, I was her oldest child, I realized that if something's missing in the world, maybe we need to put it there. Something just occurred to me during my eulogy. And I kind of knew in that moment that if the cavalry isn't coming, I guess we have to try to do something, because when you realize you're alone or that no one's going to solve something for you, it is both demoralizing, but it is also empowering, because that means that the person in your seat to the left of you, to your right of you, might be the solution. So before I lost my nerve, we went to Hacker Conference many months later in August. On August 1st, we originally submitted to the DEF CON conference, and they rejected it. They said it was too touchy-feely of an idea to say the cavalry isn't coming. It was myself and Nick Percoco. Then we decided, okay, let's do this at BSides Las Vegas, because BSides is the more inclusive, mentoring community, trying to make the world a little bit better. Ultimately, when Jeff Moss found out, he gave us a talk on the main stage at DEF CON as well, so we kind of had a dual birthday on August 1st and August 3rd. But the idea was, if no one's coming to save us, what is the hacker community willing and able to do? We said it would take years before they'd listen. We said people would likely have to die first. But our idea was basically that our dependence on connected technology was growing much faster than our ability to secure it in areas affecting public safety, human life, economic, and national security. And while there had been hacks of medical devices from the late, great Barnaby Jack, or from Jay Radcliffe, or there had been hacks on cars from, from Charlie Miller and Chris Falasek, and academics, it was mostly considered stunt hacking, or there wasn't a public consciousness that this could get pretty bad. And over time, my problem statement has changed, but basically we're over-dependent on undependable things. And since I'm a big fan of Dan Geer, and I tried to mentor myself to him, if you haven't heard him speak, he's probably one of the most measured and potent thinkers and speakers in cybersecurity. But he talks in terms of relationships. And generally speaking, if we are over-dependent on undependable things, if we're not nearly as dependent in steel and concrete, then you have two choices. You can either depend upon these things less and have lowered expectations, or you can make them more dependable. And I knew the answer was both. But it's going to take a long time to change policymakers, change software development patterns, change laws and liability. So I wanted to make sure that the dependence was proportional to how trustworthy and transparent that is. So let's get to a little bit of jumping around in time between 10 years ago and today, and somewhere in between. One of the reasons I was asked to speak here was because we both started our community efforts 10 years ago. Another reason is because of the work and the trust that we built with I Am the Cavalry and governments, when the pandemic was declared in 2020, and they recognized that they weren't very good at cyber-physical systems security yet. CISA was still quite young. CISA is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. The director of that agency, Chris Krebs, asked me to come into emergency government service. He said, how'd you like to serve your country for a year? It turned out to be longer. But I became the chief strategist for what became known as the CISA COVID Task Force. So our job was to keep hospitals as safe as possible from a scourge of ransomware attack and disruptions to supply chains, but also to protect the development and distribution of vaccines and medicines and treatments to make sure we lost fewer citizens globally. So even though it was a US effort, we worked with the international community. And hacker, philosopher, systems thinkers don't belong in the federal government. But we had to try to do whatever we could. If we're about saving lives, we better try to save lives. So we hired a few of the hackers from the hacker community, systems thinkers, doctors, infectious disease experts, and we tried to actually live it and walk the talk when it really mattered. So while we were there, I'm gonna give a few lessons from that incredibly unique experience, but also incredibly traumatizing experience. In fact, I'm not sure my career will ever be the same after. I'm having a hard time. I'm too competent to be in the government, and I'm too civically minded and publicly minded to be in the private sector. So we'll figure out if I can find my footing again. But think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It has different manifestations over time, but the idea here is you can write poetry and art and create movies and invent iPhones when you feel safe at the bottom of the pyramid. But if you don't feel safe, if you fear for food, water, shelter, we're animals, we're Lord of the Flies, and we tend to turn on each other pretty quickly. So the idea here is you're only able to operate at the levels of the pyramid where you feel safe and secure. And increasingly, we are messing with the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy. And what do I mean here? Now, this has not hit Europe as much as it's hit the US. The Russian criminal groups tend to like picking on the US a lot more than other countries. But think about the disruptions we've had since 2020. We had successful attacks on the water we drink. We've had numerous parts of the country attack the water and wastewater facilities with default hard-coded passwords. We've had attacks on the food we put on our table. One of the largest suppliers of meats in the Americas was disrupted significantly, over 20% of the meat supply. We had significant and protracted disruption on the fuel we put in our cars, our homes, and that fuel our supply chains. People were filling garbage bags with gasoline and petrol because they couldn't get enough gas during the Colonial Pipeline attacks. There are attacks on the schools our children attend, on the municipalities who run towns and cities, on governments across the globe on a regular basis. We don't seem to be able to protect anything. If there's a determined enough predator, we are prone and we are prey. And when they want to, they disrupt us with impunity. But the one that scared me the most is we had successful disruption of hospitals with now fatal consequences. My team was able to study and prove that ransomware disruptions led to loss of life during the pandemic. So this idea that we'll have to wait until people die first, we've crossed that threshold, and now many governments are listening and taking action. But before we ever got there, some of the things the cavalry did to be in a position to run security for 7,000 hospitals was we tried to use empathy and team building and get outside the hacker circles and learn how medical people talk, learn how automotive people talk, learn how oil and gas and industrial control systems people talk. So they don't care about cybersecurity in hospitals. They're starting to, but for a long time, we said, if we give you $10 million to do cybersecurity, 10 million euro, what would you do with it? And they said, well, we'd hire more nurses or we'd buy more ambulances. They're mostly concerned about patient safety or HIPAA, patient privacy. When we studied and tried to learn what they did care about, one of the most important papers in 2017 was that if you have a heart attack during a marathon race, if you're in a city that's running a marathon, you're more likely to die in a statistically significant way. And the reason is there was a 4.4 minute longer ambulance ride, and with that 4.4 minute longer ambulance ride, they could measure a 30-day mortality rate. So what does a 4.4 minute delay have to do with cybersecurity? In some ways, absolutely nothing. But what it showed us is that delayed and degraded care, irrespective of cause, was sufficient to lead to loss of life. With heart, it's 4.4 minutes could be the difference. With brain or stroke, it's called the golden hour, where 1, 3, or 4 hours could be the difference between if you walk again and talk again. There's just time is brain, is how doctors talk about it. So we paid attention to that. I was asked to serve on a task force for the US Congress, and we briefed the UK governments and lots of ANISA in Europe. But we spent about a year studying, is healthcare adding more hyperconnectivity in a way that's going to help medicine or hurt medicine? And our general conclusion at the end of 1 year was that healthcare was in critical condition. At least in US hospitals, out of the 7,000 hospitals we have, only 15% have a single qualified security person on staff. 85% don't have a single person doing cybersecurity. So if you had actionable intelligence, there's no one to act on it. They tend to be running Windows XP devices. They never patch them. They don't have segmentation and isolation. You're going to hear a talk later about isolation. They tend to have 1,400 known vulnerabilities. There's tons of reports on this. This isn't the point. But we knew things were bad in 2017. In fact, as we published this, WannaCry hit the UK hospitals pretty badly. So what we said at the time is, well, maybe if you can't afford to protect your hospital, then maybe you can't afford to connect it. And they didn't like that. And they basically said, look, we're doing the least we have to do until there's proof that people died. No one's ever died from this. So just like good hackers, what did we do? We started killing people. So we started another nonprofit called the CyberMed Summit, and in simulations in the emergency room, we would use real doctors who didn't know what was happening. We would use demonstrable hacking of medical devices to see if we could introduce confusion or panic and if it affected patient care. In the several years since we've been doing this, every scenario we've done has led to a patient coding and or a simulated loss of life. They have an implicit trust in all the technology, and these were not exotic fiction. These weren't even hacking of pacemakers where someone might just get tired. This was taking a bedside infusion pump and emptying a 3-hour dose of a calcium channel blocker in 30 seconds. So it's the right amount, too fast, cause cardiac arrest, and they lose the patient. We've also started doing simulated ransomware events to take out the single hospital, to take out every hospital in the region, to see if and when patient care was affected. So for years prior to the pandemic, we were testing how ready we were as a medical community with helpful hackers trying to save lives through preparedness. Now, that was the fire drills, but we had real fire occur with the pandemic. So everyone was panicking. We didn't know how bad it was. We didn't know if there were vaccines capable of being made for that particular type of virus. So there's a lot of unknowns. We know more now than we used to. But try to put yourself back in early 2020. I did not make this picture, but my friend was making fun of me lovingly. But we had two jobs: secure the vaccine supply chains and secure hospitals. On the vaccine supply chains first, I study Deming, I study DevOps, I study Toyota supply chains. Somebody mentioned S-bombs yesterday. I'm the daddy of S-bombs, so if you like them, you're welcome. If you hate them, I'm sorry, but not that sorry, because I think the world needs them. But in studying supply chains in other industries for many, many years, when I got to CISA and they said, we know there's 7 vaccine candidates, we know there's about 23 suppliers that they want us to protect to make sure they don't have a cyber disruption or they don't have a physical disruption to their manufacturing. But there's another 1,000 entities and we don't know how to prioritize them. Can you take care of that? So on my very first day, I said, it looks like you're prioritizing the really big brands. What about the small ball bearings? And that's from World War II. When the Allies were fighting the Nazis, they said, hey, we have this new invention. We can do bombing on just a very specific target. It's called precision bombing. What should we bomb? Because once we do this, the Germans will adapt their defenses. We'll get one shot at a surprise attack. What should we hit? And the Air Force wanted to hit anti-aircraft guns. And the Navy wanted to hit submarine manufacturing. And the Army wanted to hit tank and Jeep manufacturing. But the geeks, the economists, they said, no, 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 hit ball bearings. Every single warfighting device needs ball bearings. So whether that strategy worked or not, I asked, what are the ball bearings in the vaccine supply chains? And we used, simple weighted data science. We used a couple professionals. We tried to figure out, of the 4,000 different players, what are the small, unguarded, weak links in the supply chain that if you disrupt, you'd have millions more dead people. And we found 66. I only mention this at all, I usually skip this part, but Tiago, when I was meeting him just after this, his own open source analysis had determined some of the very same risky, small, unguarded, weak links in the supply chain. So you don't need a big government budget, you just need interest to figure out who's dependent on which things and how dependable they are. And this becomes important a little bit later. But one of the scary things about these ball bearings is they were tiny. One of the most important ones had one manufacturing facility on the whole planet. It was needed for 3 of the top vaccine candidates. They had 3 IT people, 0 security people, and their shit was all over Shodan. You didn't need any hacking. If any bad guy figured out, I can disrupt this, I can hold them ransom. Even if they didn't want to kill anybody, they would have killed millions of people. There was just too much risk on too small a target. And I call these targets target rich, but cyber poor. So they're not a Fortune 100 company, they're not a Fortune 500 company, but depending on what basic human needs you have, they may be the single most important organization on earth to protect. So we had to find them, warn them, and do whatever we could in a matter of weeks or months to try to make them a harder target. I'm gonna skip parts of this, but sometimes our hackers didn't do any hacking at all. When the vaccines were invented, we found out that we could lose 1/3 to 2/3 of the first batches of Pfizer because it needed to be ultra cold, not just cold, but ridiculously cold for the entire transportation until it was applied to the arm. We did not have enough refrigerators in the country to handle how cold they needed to be. So we had to turn to dry ice. So even though we were a bunch of hackers and systems thinkers, we had to remember dry ice evaporation rates and where it can be made and what it's made from. So we started using Wardley mapping and value chain mapping to identify weak links. And one of the most terrifying parts was not defeating biology, it was not even defeating hackers, it was defeating physics. But these are systems thinkers where we don't want to just find a single flaw in a single device, we want to find the things that actually matter to the actual outcome, because the goal of Operation Warp Speed and its successors was invent the vaccines, keep them cold, get them into people's arms to save elderly people that were dying at very large rates, 85 years old or older. So I'm going to skip a lot of that. Let's turn to hospitals briefly. So I had a lot of experience with hospitals being on the Congressional Task Force. There were 7,000 hospitals. Europe has been quite lucky relative to the US. We have over 700 ransomware disruptions each year on our 7,000 hospitals. These disruptions are getting to be larger, they're getting to be longer, they cost more than other industry ransoms, and they have now been proven to lead to loss of life. But I couldn't communicate that to hospitals. When you talk to hospital administrators anywhere, in their own language, they'll talk about the 3 S's. Remember I told you that they said, we don't fix anything until people die? When you give them money, they're always trying to spend on one of these 3 S's, space, supplies, or constraint. If you have 100 beds, which is your space, you don't have a 100-bed hospital if you only have supplies for 80 of those 100 beds. And you don't have an 80-bed hospital if you only have enough staff for 60 of those 80 beds in the 100-bed hospital. So their capacity is what they're solving for, and whatever the constraint is, they need to spend more money on. So there's no room in there for cybersecurity, and in their world, there never would be. Now, what we saw during the pandemic is whether it was biology or supply chain disruptions, all 3 of them had record high stress. So depending on which hospital it was and what month it was, there was a different constraint. And mostly, we were doing national coordination on those. In fact, sometimes a strain would hit Europe first, so the US would get to learn from Europe's mistakes. Sometimes the US did stupid things, and Europe got to learn from our mistakes. But what we noticed is their model was incomplete, because at the 1-year mark of the pandemic, so March, April of 2021, the US had lost about 500,000 people to COVID. But on top of that, they had lost 150,000 additional humans to non-COVID excess deaths above and beyond expected. And I had a hunch, based on studying those marathon studies, I'll bet you these are time-sensitive conditions like heart, like brain, like lungs, where minutes or hours are the difference between life and death. So I added this row and I said, where hearts are affected by minutes, maybe it's not carrying capacity for patients, maybe we should ensure that there's not excessive delayed access to care. The other thing we noticed is that medical technology is a force multiplier. In 1990, a single nurse taking care of babies would have 1 nurse to 1 baby, 1 nurse to 2 or 3 babies. That was about the ratio of nurses to babies. But now, armed with modern technology, they can handle 10, 12, 15 babies concurrently using a dozen or more remote monitoring stations and technologies. Here's the deal. If technology is a force multiplier for our staff, then the unavailability of that technology is a force divider. And when it goes away, very bad things happen, because the hospital that used to safely handle 3 babies now has 15. So you have the technology to handle 3 babies, but you have 15 per nurse. So what we saw is this can lead to worsened outcomes for time-sensitive care or technology-dependent care. And this is exactly what happened in Alabama in 2019. So 2 important things happened on October 1st of 2021. On the front page of the Wall Street Journal, there's a court case revealing that a baby admitted to a ransomed hospital in Alabama was born through complicated delivery. There was an umbilical cord wrapped around their neck, and while babies live and die all the time, doctors and nurses exchanged information saying that had their technology been working, they never would have lost the baby. They didn't have imaging to tell it was going to be complicated, and they didn't have good monitoring after the baby was born, and it subsequently died. In a given natal intensive care unit, there could be a dozen pieces of medical technology that assist our staff in extending the reach and quality of care in a safe manner. But when that technology goes away, it's the patients who suffer. So big deal number 1 is we've heard of the first named victim that has not been refuted or disputed, and it's likely to settle in case law. The second thing that was published that same day was by my team. We studied the effects of these ransomwares and other factors on US hospital capacity in a number of different ways through qualitative and quantitative analysis, and using some data science where we could see that every single time the US hit above 75% use of its intensive care units, we saw very large numbers of excess deaths 2, 4, and 6 weeks later. So using some published data in the CDC morbidity and mortality weekly report, we could see that if the US hit 75% capacity, you would see 18,000 dead Americans in 2 weeks. If you hit 100% capacity, you would see 80,000 dead Americans in 2 weeks. So very large numbers related to hospital strain. Now, armed with this instrument to measure hospital strain, we looked at the state of Vermont, which got hit really hard by one of the ransom attacks. It was down for a month for all of its systems in this particular community, and it was down for about 5 months before it got back to its full capacity. And measuring in the same state with the same population, adjusting for hospital type and size, we could see that communities hit by ransom achieved these stress levels sooner and stayed there longer. So we could quantify minimum, maximum, and most likely number of excess deaths associated with that ransom disruption. But more specifically, in that state, we could correlate that with the actual heart, brain, and pulmonary excess deaths in those regions. So we may not know which named people died, but we knew a very substantive number of people died. Bless you. Hopefully this pace is good. I'm gonna have to cut some other things. But what we know is if you have a disrupted ransomware, there's 2 ways to die. One is you may not survive the ambulance ride to the next nearest facility. If it's more than 4.4 minutes away or more than an hour away, this could alter your survival rates for heart and brain. But we also knew in the larger capacity that if the overflow of your patients to other facilities made a hospital too busy, you would see excess deaths later on. And then more recently, there's been several medical journals that read this and have corroborated. There was an attack in University of San Diego, Scripps Institute in San Diego in California. And some people at UCSD, a nearby set of hospitals, studied that even though they were not ransomed, their wait times and admission rates in their own hospitals were elevated due to the other hospital being ransomed. So even if you're not a victim of ransomware, your patients can suffer as you try to take on the overflow, specifically a long and protracted overflow. So when I got out of CISA, I was talking to Tiago and others about what do I do now? I'm not even sure I'm a cyber guy anymore. I've just paid attention to what the federal government and the UK government and the EMEA government and the Japanese government, everyone's doing for critical infrastructure. I felt in my bones it was the wrong way to approach it. So I'm gonna criticize the US for a few minutes here, but some of these criticisms are equally applicable here. So one thing is, I'm not gonna do the entire thing, but the US government has 16 categories of critical infrastructure. Don't even try to read them. But they're things like water and wastewater, oil and gas, electrical, healthcare. So there's one called Healthcare and Public Health, and it belongs to Health and Human Services. And just like these silos depicted here, it's one-to-one. So if you have a critical infrastructure sector, you have one government agency who technically owns that. Eventually, CISA was born 5 years ago. In fact, it just turned 5 years old yesterday. And CISA's job is to help all those. So if each of them is a silo, CISA is supposed to be cybersecurity talent, physical security talent, and free services to help all 16 sectors. The problem is the other agencies don't like CISA, don't want CISA to exist, yet they're getting over it. But the idea here is that one agency owns US hospitals. The problem with that model is that you can't have a hospital without clean water from a different agency, without chemicals from a different agency, without transportation from a different agency. These are incredibly cross-sector, multidisciplinary items. And anytime one agency tries to help another agency, they're basically told to go away. Stay out of our lane. This is our lane. Why are you in our lane? It's very siloed. And what I started to realize is that might be okay for banking. That might be okay for certain industries like software or technology. It's not okay for things at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So not only are all 16 not equally created, the people who write the Angry Birds game for your phone count as critical infrastructure. So do the people who make medical devices that keep you alive. So when everything is critical, nothing is critical. And I felt that this was not a good way to look at it. Those things up top are called national critical functions. There's 55 of them, and they're smaller, and they're more like a service. Like when you turn the water faucet on, does water come out? When you turn the light switch on, does the electricity work? Can you get timely access to patient care when and where you need it? And on that last front, that was the most disrupted during the pandemic, was timely access to patient care. So I started thinking like more quantitatively. I can't just make a list that I think is the most important. I can't just say anything at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy, water, food, shelter, safety, should be more important. So I started thinking about delay and latency sensitivity. If you map those 55 things, if you shut it off for 24 to 48 hours, does anybody die? And the answer is less than 10 of these are so latency sensitive and time sensitive that if disrupted through denial of service, through unavailability, really bad things can start to happen. But more importantly, they're not bad on their own. A disruption to water could affect your ability to get timely access to patient care. So not only is not everything equally important, some things are more dependent on others. They too have ball bearings. And when you start to realize this, the 10 most urgent, time-sensitive, life-sensitive things that cybersecurity people could find and fix flaws in are inherently multi-sector. So when one and only one agency takes ownership of these, bad things happen and people die. In fact, what's really bad, specifically about healthcare, is as we struggle and fail in healthcare, we're cutting into the talent workforce for water and wastewater engineers, for truck drivers, for manufacturing, for chemical engineers. So not only are you having disruptions, but some of the very people you're killing are necessary for other lifeline critical infrastructure services. So the bad news is also, whether it's hacking or just flu season, every single time our hospitals get overwhelmed, we lost more and more of those people. And each winter, we tended to see a pretty big spike. So what happens when people start dying? Policymakers start paying attention. Now, not everyone in this room likes government, not everyone in the room likes policy. We sure didn't. In fact, when we started I Am the Cavalry, we saw an increased criminalization of good faith research. I think we've done a lot of work. Maybe you don't all realize how hard of a battle it was, but we've decriminalized research in most countries. We've normalized the value of coordinated vulnerability disclosure. How did we do that? It wasn't hacking websites. It was showing that disruptions to healthcare devices or cars could lead to public panic or public safety issues. We have a unique, we are both willing and able to do a unique service to find these flaws and help fix these flaws. So one of the lessons that we got out of the pandemic is, whether it's hospitals or vaccine suppliers, small unguarded things, is that you could be target rich but cyber poor, which means they can't just do zero trust. They can't just hire a huge security team. Most of them don't have a single security person on staff yet. So we started saying, stop pointing to best practices. What are the bad practices? So at CISA.gov, bad practices, we enumerated 3 of the most dangerous in critical infrastructure. And by the way, the best advice for critical infrastructure tends not to be the same as the best advice for enterprise security or privacy. So some of our advice is very biased to the Fortune 100, Fortune 500, but also very biased to the confidentiality of information instead of the availability of critical infrastructure service. So some of our advice is terrible, and we're gonna have to start being clearer when we give it as to what the mission is and what the cost of failure is. Other things I had to do when we met those target-rich cyber poor is get your shit off Shodan. Although I couldn't say shit and I couldn't say Shodan, so we said get your stuff off search. But we said your assets are showing, your adversaries can see them, see what your adversaries can see, get your cyber physical systems off the network. If you can't, at least get them scanned. At least if you can't patch everything, at least focus on the network-facing, exposed, that have a known exploited vulnerability associated. So we started getting CISA to start publishing the KEV. These are known exploited vulnerabilities. Out of a given calendar year, there's less than 3% of all CVEs ever get exploited. So if you're just patching randomly on CVSS, please come in the modern age and look for EPSS, ESS, like we heard yesterday from Tiago, or the KEV list, because the KEV lists are the ones that have known to hurt people. So think about this. We went from saying everyone should do best practices and zero trust to saying, what are the most dangerous practices for cyber critical infrastructure? Can you at least look for the known exploited vulnerabilities? And since some of them want to start their journey to go from crawl to walk to run, we also got the White House liked this and asked CISA to build upon those bad practices for something called the Cyber Performance Goals, or CPGs, and other countries are modeling after this as well, which is out of the entire 400-page NIST cybersecurity framework, here are a handful of things you can do to start. One of the things that I've been very proud of, there was a little bit of discussion on it yesterday, but if anyone wants to talk about it more, is SBOM. So right around the time we started I Am the Cavalry, we said transparency is coming. You can't blindly pass risks on to all your customers anymore. You should know what's in your software, and your customers should know what's in your software. It's not, that's a longer conversation, but we knew SBOM was coming. I've been part of the SBOM push since the beginning. I tried to get a law passed in 2014, it didn't work, but fast forward, in December of last year, we did pass a law after 9 years. So when people say it can't be done or it's not being done, it's already law as of December, technically March or April this year. All FDA-approved medical devices in the US and reciprocity globally now have to do quite a few minimum cybersecurity things like be patchable, have a threat model, have a coordinated disclosure program, and have a machine-generated, machine-readable software bill of materials. And they're doing it because they want to make money. There's other places like executive orders that are also asking for it if you sell to the federal government. But we're trying to take these losses of life situations. The reason this passed, despite lots of lobbying dollars against it, is because Republicans and Democrats in the Congress realize that once people start dying, it's time to do something. So the most obvious place to do so was after a testimony to the Senate on the loss of life in healthcare. The White House is acting as well. The UK government is acting as well. CRA has some things I'm not super thrilled with, but there's a lot of international push to do things like more focus on critical infrastructure than just privacy, more things on software liability or shifting accountability to the producers of products that should be free of known exploitable vulnerabilities, should be patchable, should have coordinated disclosure. So we're taking the microcosm that we got passed into law through the cavalry on the medical devices, and we're trying to make sure any critical infrastructure is more trustworthy. So my basic plea to this community on things like this is not that I want you to go into government or be a policymaker, but we have been messing with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So when we choose what to hack, when we choose how to communicate it, the things that can lead to disruption of water, food, shelter, safety command our greatest level of attention. So a lot of us got into this profession because it was, we did this as a hobby and a curiosity. Some of you accidentally turned it into your career, and now after the last 10 years, a group of us have turned this into a way to make the world better and make the world safer. So, like I said, there's less than 10 of these critical infrastructure sector services that are life safety, 10 plus or minus a few. So we have to treat those ones with the greatest level of care. They're inherently cross-sector. Governments are very poorly set up to do this. So in the meantime, once again, the cavalry isn't coming. I'm most concerned about water and wastewater, about food supply, about oil and gas, electrical, especially target-rich cyber poor, and deeply concerned about hospitals. So I'm a little low on time for some of what I was going to cover, but one more little thought experiment. I know healthcare is different in different countries, but I want you to close your eyes and picture the hospital you would take your family to if someone was injured. What does it look like? What's its name? Now, if it was unavailable to you, where would you go instead? Is it across town? Is it very far away? Is it more than an hour away? What if that one's owned and operated by the same software and it's down too? So in the US with those 7,000 hospitals, we're seeing 6 to 12 week disruptions, 700 times a year. One of the things that I'm very proud about is we passed some federal laws for IoT cybersecurity, decriminalizing security research, SBOMs for medical devices. One of the things I'm terrified about, and this is just my map, you could do the same for yours, this is a time-lapse photography of hospitals that have closed forever. So out of those 7,000, we've lost 200 hospitals because they ran out of money. Not all of those were hacked, but recently a few of them closed their doors because what put them over the edge was their ransom attack. Many of them have only enough money to run for 1 to 4 weeks cash flow. And if you have 1 to 4 weeks of money to run the hospital and you're down for 6 to 12 weeks, it might not just knock you down for 6 weeks, it might knock you down for good. And as we see more and more hospitals close, depending on where you live, there may not be care nearby for 3 to 4 hours away from your home. So hopefully that does not happen here as much as it's happening to the US, but there's no technical barriers to that being the case. You're using the same crappy equipment, you're using the same crappy electronic medical records. So once again, even though I was very proud of what we did, I'm very, very concerned going into the next decade. And I've been asking, 10 years later, does the cavalry end? Does it transform into something new? Or does it combine with other initiatives? And I'm still trying to answer that question 3 months later, and I would love your help to do so. So we're not going to get to this today, but unlike what we discussed yesterday with LLMs, I have deep concerns again about our dependence on technology without understanding its implications. I don't think we have the right language to talk about technology risk. It's not the cost benefit on red teaming. It's not the cost benefit on writing reports. It's not the convenience of AI assistance. It's things like, how complex is the system? Is it knowable? Is it debuggable? It's things like, what's the velocity of harm? Is it slow moving and we can see it coming and avoid it? Or is it snap your fingers and people are in big, big trouble? And is the blast radius contained to a single person, to a single state, to a single country? Or does it affect the entire planet, like bioengineering can make a virus kill millions of people? So on something like our aggression and our avarice to do more and more, faster on AI, looking for the benefits, we need to be very careful on one of the most complex technologies we've ever adopted with the fastest velocity to harm and the largest blast radius. So, but mostly what I'm loving to discuss with you yesterday and today is how should we change ourselves? We like this community, we enjoy this community, and we have choices about the things we hack or how we do it or the professions we take. And I'd like to suggest that as your family and as your livelihood increasingly depend on connected technology, that means society increasingly depends on you. And I want to make sure that we're ready for that, because this community has a few interesting features in that we both hate the way things are and we hate change. And one of those things has to give. Now, quite a few of my CISO friends are leaving the profession because they can't keep pace. And we have some soul searching to do, and I don't have all the answers for you, but I know if we keep doing the same thing over and over expecting different results, the world is getting more dangerous. So we do need some heroes. I'm asking you to consider being one. If you're a humble seeker that wants to find the truth, if you want to think like a systems instead of just protecting your company or your industry, but rather society, and if you're willing to cross boundaries, we urgently need it, and we need you to find your courage and find your footing, because the cavalry isn't coming. And I'm hoping we can find fresh and new ways to raise the alarm without being alarmist. We have done incredible good. Now we need to figure out a way to scale it. Thank you.
To thank Josh, it was a great keynote. Thank you very much for coming. I think we can, one or two questions if you have it.
Anyone ask questions?
While Carl takes
We have one here.
Hello, a great talk. Why do you think that European hospitals are not so targeted as US hospitals?
One more time.
Why European hospitals are not so? They don't have so much ransomware attacks than US.
So that has been a question for a while. My general attitude for years has been that the target-rich but cyber-poor have always been vulnerable and exposed, but the predators have not been interested. And for a number of reasons, including that the US tends to pay, and that people hate the US more than other countries, the adversaries have liked picking on us. Initially, they did it by accident. I can talk more about this in the hallway, but the first hospital ransomware was not on purpose. It was in 2016 in Hollywood, California, and they were surprised they hit a hospital. The hospital did pay, and very quickly, hospitals became the #1 target of ransomware in the US. So some of it is the industries that pay to get more targeted, and some of it is the countries that retaliate the least get more targeted. So I think you're just as vulnerable. I think you've been fortunate, but I don't think you can count on that forever.
Okay, again, thank you very much. Josh will be around, so feel free to reach out to him. Thank you.
Thank you.